All right, welcome. This is a Straight A's talk show on Descartes, physics, Husserl, Einstein, all that good stuff. First, we're going to hear from Mr. Boland, and he's going to introduce his question and blog post that he found most interesting.
Okay, well, I decided to choose the blog by Mr. Gross, which was blog post 3, Group C, published February 16th, entitled One Humble Man. And basically, Mr. Gross talks about how in Descartes' in the sixth part of Descartes' method, the book that is, he talks about how basically Descartes is trying to figure out if he's weighing with himself if he should publish the book, this method that he's produced, or if he should not publish it because of all the implications that that would have. And one of the quotes that was from page 37 that I found very interesting, and obviously so did Mr. Gross, was that Descartes, while he's talking about this, says, "But I must not in any way consent to their being published," that is his book, "during my lifetime, so that neither the hostilities and the controversies, to which they might be subject, nor even such reputation as they could gain for me would give me any occasion for losing the time I have intended to use in instructing myself." So basically he's talking about here that Descartes, his main focus, as Mr. Gross states, is he wants to ensure that he has sufficient and ample time to focus on his work, right, on the method, to perfect himself. And he thinks if he publishes the book, for one thing, that he's going to end up being bombarded with mail and questions from other people, basically, who are going to get him off task, because the questions are going to lead to other questions that aren't necessarily applicable to the whole cause. And another thing that was very interesting was pertaining to that quote, was he talks about Galileo, and earlier before him, and actually more so at that time, Galileo was being persecuted by the Catholic Church for his own ideas. And the thing was, Descartes didn't think Galileo's ideas were very different, they weren't outrageous, so he figured, well, if the church, if society is going to persecute him for his ideas, then they might also persecute me. And if they persecute me, then my ideas might not necessarily get out into the public, which we have implied is more or less what he wants to do.
Yes, Mr. Boland, that's very interesting. Would you like to get to your question?
Oh, sure, I'm sorry. And so, to quickly summarize, the question basically was, did he, well, basically, I'll just get to the point. I had more notes. But is the point of the book, so all of Descartes' methods, to tell us that we need to find everything out for ourselves? And if that's the case, if we do need to find everything out for ourselves, then does it help us to have Descartes' 6 methods?
Right. Any comments on that?
I don't think that the point, it is to tell us that we should look for things ourselves and not just accept everything point blank. But I don't think the idea was as, geared at finding everything out yourself as more don't have any ideas that aren't based in reason and that you can't follow exactly why you have those ideas. And I think for that reason the book is helpful, because if you can follow directly Descartes' thoughts and why he thinks those things and then want to accept that idea, I don't think that he would really have a problem with that.
Yeah, most definitely. I think one of the things about Descartes is that he's not necessarily putting these ideas out there for his own self-fame, but he's putting them out there more for an example for us to show that, yeah, this can actually be done. Like, this isn't to tote my own horn, so to speak. Definitely.
I definitely agree with that. I think that he really wanted to perfect philosophy and perfect the world and how we go about experiencing it and observing it. So I think that that was probably the main reason why he decided to publish his book, even with the potential problems that could exist. He figured there might be some people who are okay with this idea, right, like this method, and are going to use it to help solve, some of the world's problems.
No, definitely. That was one of the big points I think that he pointed out was people need to build upon this work. Like, this isn't where it ends, but people in the future need to actually continue what I'm doing. But that kind of brings in the whole new question of, well, should we be building upon someone else's knowledge, or didn't you say in one of your methods that you wanted us to start off fresh?
Almost as a contradiction.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with Ms. Nerne, who said, the entire purpose of this book is not to tell us we have to find everything ourselves, but he does promote it, his whole idea of radical doubt.
Right.
It's that your senses, don't believe something is true until you verify it. And as we see later on in the book, it's like through mathematics, it's like through these equations which are clear and evident.
Right.
And then, as you just said about like not basing ourselves off people's work, he early on in the book he used the example of building a city. How it's like how like if you have like all these different architects building one building, they're gonna have all these different differences. Plans, and the building won't come out as
Unified.
Exactly. And then but if you have just one architect, he's able to build by himself, and he'll be able to build a building according to his plans, and it'll come out more efficient, more structural, like more intelligent.
Yeah.
Most definitely. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, like moving on, I just want to go over the idea of like the contradiction because I think it's very important to distinguish. I think that Descartes essentially saying, look, here's my method. I want you to develop your own very clear thoughts based off what he's saying. So essentially it's like, oh, use what I already have to sort of find it on your own. So it's almost like, where's the line? Can these thoughts still be your own, even though you're using this sort of methodic process?
No, most definitely, yes.
I think it's also important that you also take other people's thoughts into consideration because you can't always do everything on your own. And like, especially when it comes to math, a lot of the like equations that we know and stuff, we may understand them enough to use them, but not actually like invent them ourselves and stuff. So I think it's important to also take other people's opinions and what they've learned into consideration and then build upon it. Like, I know Mr. Gold talked about like, should we build upon what Descartes has already had? And I think we should because it gives us like a base knowledge. And I mean, you don't have to say like everything you've learned all of your life is true, but I think some of it you still need to acknowledge instead of trying to figure it out for yourself so that you have time to like make new discoveries.
In conclusion, yeah, I would definitely agree with that and say that Descartes had this ability to go off into the woods, lock himself off from the rest of society for years to try to build up this basic knowledge. And basically we all don't have that ability to do that. And I don't think Descartes trying to limit us in our search for pursuiter who can do that. He wants everyone to do that, and he's saying you can do that in your own way if you base this on him.
All right, very interesting discussion. We're going to move on to Ms. Nerdy's blog post and question. Ms. Nerdy.
I talked about actually Ms. Hanneman's post for number 4, Who Are We? And Ms. Hanneman brought up Descartes' quote where he talks about how the power of imagination is not required for his own essence, and that if he was lacking it, he would undoubtedly remain the same entity as he is now. And then Ms. Hanneman asked the question, so what makes a person who they are? And I was just wondering if you guys agree that we could completely take imagination like out of like the power to imagine things out of humans and still be the same entity. And at that point, if you can, how much can you take away from a person and still have them be like a person?
This is definitely a very interesting conversation, and I talked about it in my blog post a lot. I think that me and Ms. Henneman's blog post were very similar, and I kind of feel like I had a problem thinking that imagination wasn't a part of our essence because I was thinking about myself in terms of like a human with like a brain, but then once I started to realize that like my essence is contained in my mind, like separate from my body, and that like imagination does in fact like separate from the mind and become more one with like the body, that it was easier to like work within those like frames. So I agree that imagination is more dependent on the body.
Well,
Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
I think that imagination is something that's very important. I mean, even in our world today with more video games and stuff, we're already seeing the effects of little kids with with lack of imagination. I mean, I can even see it from when I was younger to my little brother, for example. I used to be able to go outside and like make up games and imaginary friends and all this weird stuff. Now that I look at it, I think it's really weird, but like now that I think about it, it like got your mind to start thinking and just like learn to think stuff through on your own. Where now my brother, he'll sit and watch video games or watch TV and play video games for an hour, and he goes outside and he doesn't know what to do with himself because he has no imagination at all. And I just think it's something very important in our childhood, and then later on, even in our engineering classes I've taken so far, they stress the importance of imagination and creativity because I think in any subject, it's what helps you come up with new ideas and discover new things throughout the world.
I And I was even thinking on a more basic level, like, can you even really communicate with other people if you have no ability to imagine anything? Like, if I told you, like, I was at the fridge sitting at this table and something happened, and you can't picture at all what that looks like, are you fully going to understand what I'm talking about? Or,
Right.
you know, are you even going to be able to fully function without it?
So perhaps imagination is just really important in our material world, but I wonder, do you guys think that imagination is that important in the immaterial world or like the non-real world?
I think definitely you would make the argument for that. But I think Descartes, though, obviously we could all agree, kind of draws that a line between the two. But I think, like, if you're thinking in abstract, if you're thinking in a lot of maybe, let's say, speculative philosophy, you're going to have to use some sort of imagination because a lot of it is so abstract. Like, none of us have obviously experienced certain equations or certain experiments, but we're expected to know maybe the results and such, and we need, what do we use to get that imagination sometimes? And also, building off what Miss Nerney said, she talked about how are you going to be able to relate to other people, basically, and imagination definitely, I would say, plays a big role in that, and it even goes deeper into, like, empathy. Like, if I'm so different from this person, what's going to help me to understand them? How can I put my own feet in their shoes? That's all with kind of imagination, a little bit of creativity. Without those two things, you're going to be very lackluster in that area, I think.
Yeah, and I think like what I was really trying to hone in on, which is something a little more specific, was this idea of like it being your core. You know, like your imagination essentially decides almost your personality. You know, like when you go to talk to someone or when you go to do an action, you essentially imagine yourself doing it before, and then your mind approves of what it just imagined, and then you do the action. So I think it really does define who you are to an extent where it's like if you don't have it, you're not the same person you are.
Yeah.
And then moving on with like an overarching question as to like how much, Ms. Ernie said, how much can we actually like take away till we're actually like still who we are, the essence is still there. And I think it's, even if you take, you know, one aspect away, I think that you're dramatically changing a person. So
I agree. Like imagination is like this powerful ability that we as people have. Like, it's the ability to like conjure things in our head. Maybe like as Miss Maya was talking about, like when we were kids, we could all go outside, make up games, imaginary friends. And then now, like I look at my younger cousins, watch them see TV, play video games all day too, and they have this. They just don't have the same scale of imagination as we used to. Like now, is like taking away imagination. Like, can we change? Does that change people? Just to a degree, like imagination is something that I consider something very powerful, very, very human. Now, taking away this imagination that we see in the younger generations, like it's making them much less. It's making them less human. My own personal opinion. This inability to imagine things, use their senses. I think taking imagination does make people less human.
All right, so we're going to have to move on. So Ms. Henneman, can you please discuss your blog post?
yes, so I chose Ms. Drennan's February 14th post called "Is There a Simplest Truth?" And in summary, it's simply stating that are these truths that Descartes talks about, are they actually simple? And can we actually minimize something to its simplistic form and it's still sort of like have this simple meaning, or is it actually complex? And I kind of want to preface with my question, which is Descartes' method of simplification meant to provide clarity, or is it meant to say that something is actually simple? So I think here Mr. Drennan talks about how Descartes is contradicting himself, and he's saying that essentially something can't be simplified to the extent when it's actually so complex. And so what she's saying is that these truths that he says are so simple are actually very, very difficult to understand, and his simplification is essentially providing clarity. It's not actually changing what it is and saying that's actually simple. My thoughts on it are simply that, you know, it's definitely up to the discretion of a person and what they're talking about. However, the truths that are talked about here, these simple truths, which Descartes says are the ideas of the stars and the earth and the minerals and essentially the four main parts of the earth, he says that these are the most common of all and the simplest, and as a consequence, the easiest to know. So I just think that maybe for some people it is easy to understand these things, but for others, these ideas are very abstract, and you can simplify them to the idea that, oh, the sky is there. What does it mean for the sky to be there? And what is the sky composed of? So yes, these ideas are very complex, and I think the simplification is just meant to provide clarity. It's not actually something that's very simple.
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Rowland.
Sure.
Well, I was just going to provide a little bit of clarity. When G talks about the process of simplification on page 11, it's his third point in the method. It says, to conduct my thoughts in an orderly fashion by commencing with those objects that are simplest and easiest to know in order to ascend little by little as by degrees to the knowledge of most composite things. So Ms. Henneman is talking about that process of simplification. And I think personally that what he's saying is that he's taking the simplest things, not for clarity, but then to build off of them for a greater understanding of larger problems, truths, things like that.
Right.
Mr. Bullen, were you going to add something?
I was just going to draw back to page 35 and what Ms. Hanneman just talked about, but he talks kind of about how all of us have within us this same basic level of common sense that he asserts if we use it, we should be able to more or less be able to comprehend the same things, basically. We should be able to build up our knowledge, as Mr. Osher just said, in certain areas by going from simplest to greatest and attaining that knowledge, which is the goal of the discourse.
Just to interject, I think like what you both said is very accurate with like this sort of like building from the foundation. However, his examples, the things that he finds simple are, the heavens, the stars, the earth, water, and air, and fire. So I think that essentially here you're starting with a very complex idea and then you're building on to even more complex ideas. Whereas I think you should start with something even more simplistic and then build on from there, which is just supporting the idea that it's not actually simple, it's actually very complex and clarity is just offered.
So if you had to start with the most simple, what would you do and not for like the water, the earth, things like that?
Yeah, well I would start with the structure of each one.
Okay.
Yeah, but then again, I mean you could also argue the other side of that, saying, well the structure of water is actually very complex.
Yeah,
So
but we wouldn't
whereas-
have been able to discover the structure of water without, different scientific tools,
or yeah, understanding like what water is. So
Yeah.
it's sort of like where do you begin, or where do you even, what is so simple? I think that again is up to what a person thinks. Maybe I think water is simple, maybe you think the molecular structure is simple. But
I'm going to go with the molecular structure is harder, but that's just All right, any other just points that you guys would like to bring up? No? Okay, then we're going to move on to Mr. Ramos's.
So my blog post, I chose Miss Nerdy's 5th blog post, I believe it is. Can't have one without the other, on the reading of Husserl. In that blog post, Miss Nerdy, she talked about how Husserl, he has nature, then there's this physical world. Pretty much basing himself off, talking about Descartes' dualism, practical philosophy, speculative philosophy. Miss Nerdy pretty much sums up her blog post by stating how Husserl thinks we should all get these ideas and practices from practical philosophy and then apply them to speculative philosophy. Well, what I want to ask Ms. Nerdy is or everybody else here is don't you think that there shouldn't be two distinct paths of philosophy, practical and a speculative one, but one combined philosophy so we can have aspects of both philosophy and use them together in order to, for the benefit of mankind.
So, just to clarify, are you saying a third strain?
No,
I think
I'm
you said
saying
combining
yeah,
the two.
Okay.
And I think, because they used to be combined and then they were split, and I think that you definitely need both of them, which is where I felt like Husserl was putting more of the focus on practical philosophy because it has the clear and distinct evidence behind it to back it up. But you definitely need both, but I think that it is good that they're separated because it allows people to specialize in more one idea or the other, and breaking the practical philosophy allowed to break into all the different sciences physics, medicine, things like that, which help find new things.
I think it's important that they're separated too because then we can start to reach conclusions. Because the problem with speculative is we never really get a full answer, which it's great for discussion purposes and stuff between people, and you might reach a conclusion that way. But when you separate them, we're actually able to apply mathematics and reasoning to them and reach an actual answer. So it might be important in, say, the first steps of something, and then maybe we should start to apply mathematics and stuff to reach an answer. Because if we don't do that, then we would never have an answer. or anything, and I know that would be infuriating to a lot of people.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that Husserl actually talks about this. He says that the split between the natural and the psychic world was unavoidable at the beginning of the modern period. So I think he's talking about the modern period from Descartes on. But then he goes on to say that natural science possessed the highest rationality because it was guided by pure mathematics. This is slides 16 to 17. And then he says, should this not become the model of all genuine knowledge? So I think that he is pushing for a reintegration of the two different worlds and the two different philosophies.
Definitely, and I think that the two almost need to be separate. I sort of we can kind of come to like a consensus here because like the two need to be separate in the beginning, sort of like develop the theories and create the specialization. But then as you sort of get to the point where you're trying to get to, then I think you can sort of apply them to each other and have this sort of combined effect. Because I think, of course, keeping them completely separate, you have no application of the other, and like you said, speculation continues. So I think they can definitely exist in tandem and together, creating this idea of dualism.
Any final thoughts on this?
I was just going to add, you guys pretty much all summed it up already, but I think one of the reasons that he talks about mathematical results and the importance of practical philosophy is because really speculative philosophy prior was the type of philosophy that was really emphasized. And now it's almost this new age, this new era that we talk about with practical. And since he does, as Mr. Osher already said, he wants to make this thought the model of all genuine knowledge so we can think of it spans every possible thing and every other discipline. It makes sense that he wants to put a practical focus on this.
And just to conclude with this general idea, I think when we were all reading, Plato and these sort of classical philosophers, we would close the book and say, well, what now? We have this concept of virtue, we have this concept of overarching things, but what do we do with it, or how do we apply it? And I think finally this idea of dualism is saying, here's how we can use it, here's how we can make it applicable to our lives.
That's definitely very interesting. We do have to move on, but luckily we get to stay with Husserl because my question is about Husserl. So I did Miss Naomi's blog post, and she was talking about the separation of the natural and the psychic world. And basically she was questioning whether or not we could apply pure mathematics to the psychic world. And so that was what I wanted to continue discussing. So my question is it possible to apply pure mathematics to non-corporeal inventions of the human mind, such as politics, natural life, or history? I use these examples because they're not something you can sense and they're not something you can touch. Like it's not corporeal. So just to clarify that.
Yeah, I think we kind of talked about this actually today in class, but I really am a firm believer as of right now, until maybe I'm proven otherwise, which might happen, but that I do not think mathematics can always be applicable to the natural self, to politics, to history. In some cases, it most definitely can. There can be equations that will more or less fit a certain specifications that will allow for a certain result to happen. But I think in a lot of cases, that's not necessarily going to be the case. It can definitely help in it, but it's not always going to be the case. And I think history is a great example of that. You cannot make an overarching statement to say, just because x plus z plus y with a variable of a happens, this will be the intended result, because there's always going to be things you do not know. And that's what I think math doesn't necessarily take into account that deals with history and politics.
See, Connor, I'm going to have to disagree with you. Because
Okay.
I think that you can take politics and take history and sort of zoom in on these ideas and apply formulas specifically to the ideas we're talking about. Now, I do agree with you on the overarching principles. We can't find out what we're trying to find out, but I think the point of mathematics and the point of using different variables and algebraic equations is to sort of figure out what we don't know.
Right.
And I think that if we can kind of retroactively look back in history, sort of zoom in and say, oh, well, why did Napoleon do what he did? Well, maybe we can use this sort of cognitive formula to try and figure it out. But I think you can zoom in on certain aspects with mathematics.
I definitely agree with certain aspects, but when it comes down to it, you can't really use math to, measure anything with human interaction. And that's going to be a big part of things like history and politics and virtues and things like that. And you're not going to be able to apply a formula to understand why exactly people act the way they do. Maybe with chemical balances and things like that, but you're not going to come to a real answer. Why did this person like this one and not the other?
Right. You're not going to be able.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
No, please
Okay.
don't.
My biggest thing was, I'm not super religious at all, but I know a lot of people are, and I know that there's been problems with this in the past, and people trying to apply science and stuff to try and figure out like, what happens in the afterlife, or like was the stuff in the Bible like real and stuff. And I feel, and I know people might not like this, I feel like there's some things we're just not meant to know. And I even talked about this in, I don't know if it's that blog post or others, that sometimes too much knowledge is not a good thing. Knowledge is great and it yields a lot of power, but sometimes too much power can lead to some very bad things. And so I strongly believe that there's some things in the world that we're just not meant to know and understand. And that's why I have the problem of applying mathematics to every aspect.
I think that brings up the idea of like not meant to know and cannot know. You know, because like what the argument here is that like, oh well, we can't sort of take mathematics and apply it to like history or like you said, like cognitive function. But I think what you're saying is that there's this overarching like philosophical idea that we really shouldn't even know it because it's
Yeah. So unfortunately, we do have to move on. All right, Ms. Maui, take it away.
Okay, I picked Miss Martin's blog post on Meditations number 6, and basically it was about the debate of pure imagination and intellection. And in this, Descartes brings back his thoughts on like senses and stuff, and he actually kind of switches his idea and says, oh, well, maybe I do need these. And so my question is since Descartes is now acknowledging his senses, does it go against his previous theories and allow room for error now in his reasoning?
I think that it definitely expands on that because, I think that doubting his senses was part of his process because, he said, this is what I'm going to do, this is what I'm going to, I'm going to doubt everything. But I think that he moved beyond that to try to, come up with the things that he ended up stating in section 6. And so I think that it was necessary to doubt, but it doesn't necessarily contradict it. It's just like how he developed his ideas further than at first doubting his senses. Any other thoughts?
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but like the way I see the question is how it goes, it's like, do you think like he started off saying it's like, oh, doubt your senses, like don't trust him, and now the fact that he's kind of relying on his senses to this material things, it's like the fact that he switches idea around, it's like, does that mean that his process isn't entirely right, that there could be something wrong with the process? That's the way I interpret the problem. And I think, when you look at his idea of all this radical doubt, sort of the reasoning, it doesn't really go anywhere. You get something, you doubt that it exists, you move on and then use your senses. Oh, it exists, but then you doubt it again. It feels like this whole circular reasoning thing seems to get nowhere. And I think that isn't a really efficient method.
Any other thoughts?
My problem is that previously he said that senses leave room for error, and so now I don't understand how they don't lead to error. Is my only problem, because how is he supposed to know something's 100% true if he's using his senses? Because then it seems to me that he's allowing error. So does he just not believe anything is completely 100% now?
No, I agree completely with you, Ms. Maui. And it almost, to me, at least when I first read that, it's a clear and certain contradiction of his previous statement in the 4-step method. And the question I think really is, does this void the whole 4-step method now that he's going back on this one thing? And in this case, I don't think he's shown us yet if that's the case or not, but I think it gives us even more reason to doubt or to question his method now that he's gone back on this, because it really, and he also goes back on radical doubt as well. He no longer holds that to be the case, so it's really.
See,
We have one last thought for 30 seconds.
I found this to be a beautiful interpretation of what's actually going on here, because I think that with Descartes sort of going back and saying, maybe we do need our senses, it's actually him using his method to come to this conclusion. He sort of had this statement and he had this doubt and he made these observations and he's using exactly what he originally intended to use in order to come up with this conclusion. So I think it's just a beautiful exemplification of what he's trying to get at here. And that is the final answer.
All right, so we are all out of time. Thank you for watching our talk show. We hope that you enjoyed our discussion on Descartes, existence, physics, and all the other fun stuff we mentioned.
Oh, yes.